Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Consider the task of memorizing an encyclopedia.
Right.
You have to commit it to memory perfectly,
Yeah.
syllable by syllable, backwards and forwards, and you have to do all this without ever writing down a single word.
Which is a massive undertaking.
Exactly. Now add the condition that if you make even one slight error in pronunciation, or even pitch in G, you genuinely believe the fundamental order of the universe might fall out of balance.
Yeah, the stakes are cosmic.
So today, for our History of Religion series, we are exploring the Vedas. These are the foundational sacred scriptures of Hinduism. We are going to look at the words these texts contain, but more importantly, we need to understand the mechanics of how they were composed.
And how they were protected.
Right, how they were protected for thousands of years entirely by word of mouth. We will also look at how they established the groundwork for Indian philosophy, social structures, and some highly contested modern historical debates.
Because this really is an exploration into the DNA of ancient Indo-Aryan culture.
It is. Understanding the Vedas is crucial for you, the listener, whether your interest lies in the mechanics of ancient linguistics, the puzzle of early history, or just the sheer capacity of human memory.
Well, to accurately approach these texts, we cannot simply look at them as a collection of old books sitting on a shelf.
Right.
Before we examine the oral texts themselves, we first need to establish how the ancient composers conceptualized the very idea of this knowledge.
Because it is a very specific conceptualization.
It is. The traditional Hindu perspective on these verses is fundamentally different from how modern readers view a piece of literature or a historical document.
Yeah, I mean, even the word Veda itself carries a very specific weight in the sources. The etymology stems from the Sanskrit root vid, which translates directly to know.
Exactly.
But the context indicates this denotes a sacred or divine insight. It is not everyday, mundane knowledge like knowing how to build a cart or how to navigate a river.
No, not at all. And within the broader context of Hindu scriptures, there is a strict categorization separating different types of knowledge. You have two main categories.
Okay.
There is Sruti and Smriti. Sruti translates to that which is heard. Smriti translates to that which is remembered. The Vedas are strictly classified as Sruti. They are considered absolute revelations.
So if we look at something like the ancient epics or the later law codes, those fall under Smriti.
Right.
They're acknowledged as texts authored by human beings who remembered events or codified social rules. But Sruti is presented as fundamentally different in its origin.
It connects directly to the doctrine of apauruṣeya. That specific term translates to authorless, superhuman, or impersonal.
Authorless.
Yes. In the traditional Orthodox view, which was later rigorously championed by philosophical schools like Mimamsa and Vedanta, the Vedas were not written or composed by anyone, human or divine.
Oh, okay, so not even by gods.
Exactly. They are considered nikya, meaning eternal truths. The doctrine posits that they predate the physical universe itself. They are understood as primordial vibrations, or Shabda Brahman, which existed before the current cycle of creation and will continue to exist after its dissolution.
Let me stop and make sure the mechanics of this are clear, because an authorless text is a difficult concept to grasp.
It definitely takes some unpacking.
It feels somewhat comparable to discovering a fundamental law of physics. A scientist doesn't invent gravity, right?
Right, they observe it.
And they don't author the laws of thermodynamics. They uncover an existing truth about the universe. So from the traditional perspective, the ancient sages were uncovering the cosmic background radiation of spiritual truth.
That is a very accurate way to conceptualize the traditional view.
They didn't write a poem. They tuned their minds to a frequency that was already broadcasting.
The individuals who receive this knowledge are known as rishis, which translates to sages or seers. According to the tradition, these rishis did not sit down and draft the hymns. Instead, during states of profound meditation and severe ascetic discipline, they cognized or heard these eternal truths. They acted purely as conduits for a pre-existing reality.
Just picking up the signal.
Precisely. They perceived the verses through direct intuitive insight, which is known as drishti. Their role was to receive the sound without altering its inherent perfect form.
The sources mention that later narratives built an entire mythology around this transmission process.
Yes, the later Puranic texts expand upon this idea of cosmic emanation to make it more accessible to people. In the Puranas, the texts describe the deity Brahma proclaiming the Vedas from his four mouths at the dawn of creation.
Right.
It is presented as a literal emanation of knowledge intended to benefit humanity in the current eon. There is also another notable narrative involving the deity Vishnu.
And this one involves a recovery mission, essentially.
It does. The story details that when the world was in a state of primordial chaos, two demons named Madhu and Kaitaba stole the Vedas.
Stole the eternal knowledge.
Yes. And to recover the texts and restore cosmic order, Vishnu had to incarnate as the horse-headed figure Rigveda.
Which is a very vivid image.
Extremely vivid. But these stories serve to emphasize a specific theological point. The knowledge itself is imperishable. It is not a historical artifact that can be destroyed.
It is a permanent feature of the cosmos.
Exactly. It occasionally has to be recovered, defended, or transmitted, but it is never created from nothing.
Well, if these texts represent eternal, formless cosmic truths, how are they practically organized for human beings to actually utilize? I mean, they couldn't just remain abstract concepts.
No, that'd be structured.
Right, they needed a framework.
And the organization is highly systematic. The entire corpus is divided into 4 primary collections, known as the 4 Vedas.
Okay, let's walk through those.
First, we have the Rigveda, which is universally acknowledged as the oldest. It contains hymns directed to various natural deities and is organized into 10 books, or mandalas.
For Rigveda is the one we hear about the most.
Usually, yes. Then there is the Yajurveda, which is largely comprised of prose formulas specifically meant for the execution of sacrificial rites.
So more of a manual.
Exactly. Third is the Samaveda, which is deeply intertwined with the Rigveda. The Samaveda actually adapts many Rigvedic hymns into melodic chants.
Ah, okay. So it adds music.
It incorporates detailed musical notations, utilizing a 7-note scale, and interjects specific syllables called stohas.
What are stopas?
They are sounds like ha or hoy. These syllables have no semantic meaning, but they are absolutely crucial for the musical and rhythmic structure of the chants.
You've laid out the first 3, and they sound like a cohesive package dealing with high cosmic rituals and complex musical theory.
They are very unified in that sense.
But the sources detail a 4th collection, the Atharvaveda, and the content there feels entirely different.
It is quite different.
The Rigveda is dealing with the creation of the cosmos, but the Atharvaveda is full of healing spells, incantations for finding a spouse, and formulas for agricultural success.
Very practical daily concerns.
Yeah. So how did a text dealing with such mundane everyday matters get grouped with the cosmic rituals of the other 3? Was it viewed differently by the ancient practitioners?
That is a critical observation, and historically there was indeed a significant distinction. For a very long time, ancient scholars and priests referred to the triple Veda, the Rig, Yajur, and Sama, as the absolute core of the high, formal, sacrificial religion.
So the Atharvaveda was kind of an outlier initially.
The Atharvaveda was formally recognized slightly later as the 4th Veda. However, its historical and sociological importance cannot be overstated.
Why is that?
Well, while the first 3 Vedas focus heavily on the Sarota rituals, which were massive, expensive public sacrifices sponsored by kings and wealthy elites to maintain the universe, the Atharvaveda addresses the Griya rituals.
Vajur rituals.
Yes, these are the rituals of the domestic sphere. It provides an invaluable window into ancient medicine, agriculture, and daily survival.
That makes sense. It's what the average person was actually doing.
Right. In fact, some sources indicate it contains over 30 chapters dedicated entirely to love relationships, sexuality, and conceiving a child. It grounds the abstract cosmic order firmly in the physical reality of human existence.
Okay, so we have these 4 major collections, but the structure goes even deeper. Each of these 4 Vedas is subdivided into 4 specific layers of text.
Correct. The internal architecture of each Veda reveals a lot about the intellectual evolution of the society.
So it's like a timeline within the text itself.
Essentially, yes. The first layer consists of the Samhitas. These are the core collections of mantras and benedictions.
The basic verses.
Right. Next are the Brahmanas. These are essentially extensive prose manuals and commentaries explaining the complex rules for the rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices, which are known as yajnas.
So the Samhitas are the words you say, and the Brahmanas tell you exactly how to say them and what to do while saying them.
That is a good way to look at it. Third, we have the Aranyakas, which are frequently referred to as the forest texts.
I want to pause on the Aranyakas, because this feels like a major turning point in the sources. Why are they called forest texts? And why did the focus of the texts shift at this point?
The shift to the Aranyakas marks a transition away from the highly public, physical rituals described in the Brahmanas. As the society evolved and the towns and settlements became more complex and crowded, Certain individuals, ascetics, and thinkers chose to retreat into the forests.
To get away from the rigid structure of the towns.
Exactly, to pursue deeper contemplation. The Aranyakas focus on symbolic, internalized sacrifices.
Internalized how?
Instead of physically throwing clarified butter into a massive fire altar, the practitioner in the forest might meditate on the concept of fire. Or they might equate the physical fire with the internal fire of digestion or human consciousness.
Which leads directly into the fourth and final layer of each Veda.
Yes, the Upanishads. The Upanishads represent the culmination of this inward turn.
These are the philosophical texts.
Deeply philosophical. They discuss meditation, metaphysics, the nature of the self, which is known as the Atman, and the ultimate reality of the universe, known as Brahman.
When you look at this four-part structure, Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, it is essentially a map of an entire civilization's intellectual development.
It maps a very clear progression.
You start with humans singing hymns to the storm gods out in the elements. Then they institutionalize those hymns into rigid, complex rituals in the Brahmanas.
Yeah.
Then some people get disillusioned with the rigid rituals and retreat to the forest with the Aranyakas.
Right.
Finally, they sit down and produce the Upanishads, completely turning the inquiry inward to ask fundamental questions about existence.
That trajectory perfectly describes the transition from what traditional Indian philosophy calls karmakanda, the section of the texts focused on outward ritual action, to jnanakanda.
And Janakanda is the philosophical part.
Yes, the section focused on inner philosophical knowledge. We are talking about a truly massive corpus of literature. Just the Samhitas contain 20,379 mantras.
That is a staggering number.
Over 37,000 verses are Rigvedic in origin across the various texts. It is a monumental record of human thought, transitioning from the strict performance of a physical sacrifice to the profound metaphysical contemplation found in the Upanishads.
So, to comprehend how these four massive collections of text were forged, we really have to look closely at the specific language they employ and the historical window in which they were created.
The language of the texts is Vedic Sanskrit. It is an archaic Indo-Aryan dialect that significantly predates classical Sanskrit.
How different is it from classical Sanskrit?
Quite different. When linguists examine the grammar and syntax of the Vedas, they find highly complex features that are entirely absent in the later standardized variants of the language.
For example?
For example, Vedic Sanskrit uses dual number forms. In modern English, we have grammar for singular and plural, right?
Yeah, one or many.
Vedic Sanskrit has a specific grammatical structure strictly for pairs. 2 eyes, 2 horses, 2 gods acting together. It also features augmentless verb roots. And crucially, it possesses a strict tonal pitch accent system where the pitch of a syllable fundamentally alters the meaning of a word.
So a word spoken with a high pitch could mean something entirely different than the same word spoken with a low pitch.
Exactly.
When the sources talk about the metrical structure, they mention that the verses were composed in specific poetic meters, like Gayatri and Anustuv.
This strict metrical structure was not just for aesthetic poetry. It was a highly engineered mechanism for preservation. Vedic Sanskrit is incredibly conservative.
Meaning it didn't change much over time.
Right. It maintains specific linguistic features like aspirated stops and particular vowel gradations that were completely lost in the epic Sanskrit, used to write texts like the Mahabharata by roughly 400 BCE.
Let's clearly define what an aspirated stop is,
Yeah.
because that term comes up frequently in the linguistic analysis.
An aspirated stop refers to a consonant pronounced with a strong, audible burst of breath. Think of the difference in English between the P in spin and the P in pin. The P in pin has a burst of air. It is aspirated. Vedic Sanskrit had a very complex system of these aspirated consonants.
And over time, people just stopped using that burst of air.
Exactly. Over centuries, as languages naturally evolve, human beings tend to simplify pronunciation. Those heavy bursts of breath gradually softened or vanished in later dialects.
So by tracking how those heavy breaths softened and vanished over time, like cracking a genetic mutation in DNA over thousands of years, linguists can trace exactly how old a specific layer of text is.
That is the core of comparative linguistics, yes.
By rigorously analyzing these archaic linguistic features and tracing the word roots back to the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language, modern philologists have been able to establish a chronology. What timeline does that analysis give us?
The general consensus among philologists estimates that the bulk of the Rigveda was compiled between 1500 and 1200 BCE.
1500 to 1200 BCE.
Yes. And the other 3 Vedas, the Yajurveda, Samaveda and Atharvaveda are generally dated to the subsequent period, between 1200 and 900 BCE.
Here's where I have to push back a bit on the certainty of that dating.
Okay, go ahead.
If this is an entirely oral tradition, if there are absolutely no physical manuscripts from 1500 BCE to put under a microscope or test in a lab, how can philologists precisely pinpoint a date like 1500 BCE?
It is a fair question. It requires a process of intense triangulation. Linguists look at the evolution of the language itself and they compare it to other ancient languages, most notably Old Avestan.
What is Old Avestan?
It is the language of the Zoroastrian texts in ancient Iran. The linguistic similarities between the Rigveda and the Gathas of the Avesta are so close they share exact phrases and grammatical structures that they point to a shared ancestral language spoken by a single group shortly before that period.
Okay, so the language is split around that time.
Right. Furthermore, scholars use textual clues, specifically what physical objects are mentioned in the verses and what objects are noticeably absent.
It is essentially dating a text by treating the language and the technology mentioned within it as markers of time.
Exactly.
We are dating this corpus, much like dating an ancient tree. You don't just look at the outer bark, you cut it open and look at the rings. But here, we aren't looking at physical rings of wood. We are looking at linguistic rings.
That is a great analogy.
If the text mentions bronze, but never mentions iron, we know the text must have been composed before the Iron Age reached that specific geographical region. If it mentions domesticated horses and war chariots, we have to look at the physical archaeological record in the dirt to see when those specific technologies were present in the Indian subcontinent.
That is precisely the methodology applied by historians and linguists. The Rigveda, for instance, frequently mentions copper and bronze, referred to as ayas, but it does not definitively mention iron.
Interesting.
The Atharvaveda, which is dated to a later period, contains clear, distinct references to iron, specifically calling it black copper or dark metal.
So there's a clear technological shift recorded in the text.
Yes. This places the composition of the Rigveda firmly in the late Bronze Age transition. It provides a temporal anchor based on metallurgical technology.
Well, knowing that these texts were composed over 3,000 years ago raises a massive logistical puzzle. We're talking about tens of thousands of verses. How do you keep that much information perfectly intact for millennia without writing a single word down?
The answer lies in the institution of the Guru Shishya Parampara, the rigorous teacher-student lineage.
Because writing just wasn't an option.
In the ancient Vedic context, writing was not merely unavailable. It was actively and intentionally avoided for the preservation of these sacred texts.
Really, they avoided it even when it became available.
Yes. Evidence suggests writing only emerged in the region after 500 BCE. But for many centuries after writing became available, oral transmission was still considered the only pure and authoritative method for the Vedas.
So reading it off a page was seen as, what, lesser?
Exactly. Auditory fidelity was paramount. The physical sound itself, the exact pitch, the duration of the vowel, the specific consonant, was deemed to possess cosmic power.
We mentioned earlier that to them, a mispronounced word wasn't a typo, it was a cosmic disaster. So they had to develop an actual science of oral transmission to prevent human error.
They developed what are known as pathas, which are highly intricate, mathematically structured modes of recitation designed to eliminate any possibility of a syllable being lost or altered.
Mathematically structured.
Yes. These pathas functioned as a layered system of vocal cross-verification.
The sources outline two main categories for these methods,
Yeah.
Prakriti pathas and Vikriti pathas.
Let's start with the first. Prakriti translates to natural. These were the foundational ways of reciting the text. The first method is Samhita patha, which is continuous recitation.
Just reading it straight through.
Right. It mirrors the original flow of the text, preserving all the natural euphonic combinations of syllables. In Sanskrit grammar, the way words blend together when spoken quickly is called sandhi. Samhita patha preserves that natural, fluid blending.
But if words are constantly blending together, a young student might not know where one word actually ends and the next begins, right? Over a few generations, that could lead to the text being corrupted or misunderstood.
Exactly. To solve that specific problem, they created the second natural method, Padapatha.
And what does that entail?
This involves breaking the entire text down word by word. It intentionally strips away all the sandy blending to isolate every single word in its pure grammatical form.
I see.
This ensures the student understands the exact morphology of each word and prevents them from conflating adjacent syllables.
Then the system gets intensely mathematical with the Vikriti pathas, which are the derived forms.
Yes. This is where the extreme redundancy is built into the system. One of these methods is Kramapatha, where the student is required to recite the words in sequential pairs.
Okay, how does that work?
If the words in a line of text are A, B, C, and D, the student recites A, B, then B, C, then C, D. This creates an interlocking chain of words.
And it gets even more complex from there.
It does. There is Janapatha, which alternates forward and reverse sequences. So the student recites AB, then BA, then AB again.
Wow, okay.
Then they move to the next pair, B, C, C, B, B, C. But the absolute pinnacle of this mnemonic science, the most complex form of recitation, is known as Ganapatha.
Walk us through the mechanics of Ganapatha slowly, because when I read this in the sources, it seemed almost impossible for a human brain to process in real time.
It is quite a cognitive feat.
Uh-huh.
For a basic sequence of 3 words, word 1, word 2, word 3, the Ganapatha recitation follows this exact pattern.
Okay, and Wesley.
Word 1, word 2, word 2, word 1, then word 1, word 2, word 3, then word 3, word 2, word 1, and finally word 1, word 2, word 3 again.
Just for 3 words.
Yes. It is a continuous triple reversal system applied to tens of thousands of words.
It functions exactly like cryptographic hashing in modern computer science.
Anything.
Well, if you think about a modern blockchain or a digital file transfer, we use complex algorithms to create redundancy in the code. We generate a checksum. If a single byte of data is corrupted during the transfer, the checksum fails, and the system instantly flags the error.
That is a very fitting parallel.
The ancient Vedic composers essentially built a vocal checksum directly into their educational system. If a student drops a syllable or alters a pitch, the entire mathematical pattern of the Ganapatha immediately breaks. The interlocking chain fails, and the community of scholars instantly catches the error.
The training required to master this system was immense. Learning these advanced forms of recitation could take 12 to 13 years of rigorous daily practice under the strict supervision of a guru.
12 years just on recitation.
Yes. And the precision required was not just about remembering the correct words. It was heavily focused on the svara, the exact tonal pitch, whether the syllable was high, low, or circumflex.
Because of the cosmic stakes we mentioned earlier.
Right. The ritual necessity dictated this level of extreme precision. A sacrifice was only believed to be effective in maintaining the universe if the mantra was pronounced with absolute phonetic perfection. A mistake could render the entire ritual void, or, according to the texts, actively bring negative consequences upon the sponsor of the ritual.
The result of this system is statistically striking. The sources note that when modern scholars finally compared oral traditions from widely separated geographic regions in India with physical manuscripts that appeared much later from the 11th century CE onward, the oral traditions had maintained over 95% consistency.
It completely outperforms many ancient written traditions.
We're talking about tens of thousands of verses passed down from teacher to student for 3 millennia with less than a 5% variance. That is incredible.
Written texts are highly susceptible to scribal errors, mistranslations by later copyists, or the physical degradation of the manuscripts themselves due to fire or dampness. The oral checksum system proved far more durable than ink and palm leaves.
We just spent all this time talking about how they built essentially a mathematical linguistic fortress to protect every single syllable. Why? Because to them, a mispronounced word wasn't a simple error, it was a cosmic disruption. And that brings us to the core of their entire worldview.
The concept of rota.
Right. What exactly did these perfectly preserved words reveal about how these ancient people viewed the universe?
At the very center of the Vedic worldview is the foundational concept of Raita. Raita is the immutable, overarching cosmic order. It governs absolutely everything in existence.
Everything from the weather to human behavior.
Exactly. It regulates the natural phenomena, the cycle of the seasons, the motion of the stars and planets, and crucially, it also governs human ethics and social behavior. Raita is the active principle that orchestrates the universe, demanding truth, right action, and precise ritual from humanity to mirror and support the natural laws.
This concept of an immutable order extended directly into how they conceptualized and structured their own society. The text that is most frequently referenced in the sources regarding this is the Purusha Sukta, which is found in the 10th mandala of the Rigveda, specifically hymn 10.90.
The Purusha Sukta is a profoundly influential cosmological hymn. It describes the creation of the known universe resulting from the sacrifice of a primordial cosmic giant known as the Purusha.
A giant is sacrificed to create the world.
Yes, and the hymn states that from the different parts of the sacrificed Purusha's body, the four Varnas, the primary societal classes, were born.
How does the text break that down?
The Brahmins, who were the priests and preservers of sacred knowledge, emerged from the mouth of the Purusha. The Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, came from the arms. The Vaishyas, the agricultural producers and merchants, emerged from the thighs. And the Shudras, the laborers and service providers, came from the feet.
This is a text that has obviously had a massive and frequently highly contested impact on later Indian history, as it laid the textual groundwork for what would eventually calcify into the caste system. But how did the original composers view this sacrifice? Why did sacrificing a giant create a social structure?
It is essential to analyze what the text originally represented within its specific historical context. In the early Vedic era, this Varna system was primarily functional and interdependent.
So not strictly hereditary from the very beginning.
It was conceptually based on inherent qualities, which they called guna, and actions called karma, rather than a rigidly fixed, birth-based hierarchy. The society at that time was semi-nomadic and pastoral, transitioning to settled agriculture.
Right. They were a society in a fragile state of development.
Exactly. A society in that state required a strict division of labor to survive hostile environments. The hymn uses the metaphor of the sacrificed body to portray society as a single, living organism where every part from the mouth that recites the chants to the feet that support the weight is entirely necessary for the whole entity to function.
The reliance on the environment is a major theme here. Let's look at a practical scenario from that era. We have an ancient community totally dependent on the local ecosystem. They are waiting for the monsoon rains to arrive.
Which is a matter of life and death.
Right. If the rains fail, the crops die, the cattle die, and the community starves. They turn to the Brahmins, the priests, who utilize these precise, mathematically perfect chants to invoke the natural deities. Deities like Indra, the god of thunder and rain, or Agni, the god of fire.
They are performing these complex rituals not merely as a passive religious observance.
Exactly, it's an active survival mechanism. They believe the vibration of the chants will align their local environment with Rata, the cosmic order, to avert a drought. There's a deep, functional ecological awareness driving the entire system.
Absolutely. We see this ecological awareness clearly articulated in hymns like the Nadastuti Sukta, which explicitly invokes and praises the major rivers. They recognize their profound life-or-death dependence on natural forces.
They weren't taking nature for granted.
Not at all. The rituals were an attempt to propitiate those forces, maintaining an equilibrium between human action and environmental patterns. The rivers, the fire, the wind, these were not abstract concepts. They were active participants in the survival of the community.
But the Rigveda is not purely a manual of rituals and environmental appeasement. There's a notable philosophical depth that emerges, particularly toward the end of the collection.
Yes, the 10th mandala is very rich in this regard.
The text that stands out in the sources is the Nasadiya Sukta, also found in the 10th mandala, hymn 10.129.
The Nasadiya Sukta, often referred to as the creation hymn, is one of the most remarkable texts in ancient world literature.
Yeah.
It approaches the origins of the universe not with the absolute certainty of a ritual manual, but with profound skepticism and deep metaphysical speculation.
How does it begin?
It begins by stating that before the universe existed, there was neither existence nor non-existence. It posits an underlying mysterious unity referred to as Tathakam, which translates to that one. Yes. This was a primordial, unnameable reality that existed before the gods themselves were born.
The ending of that specific hymn is incredible, especially given the context of the rest of the text. It basically asks, who really knows where the universe came from?
It is very open-ended.
Right. It points out that even the gods came into being after the creation of the universe, so the gods cannot possibly know how it started. It concludes by saying that perhaps the creator of the universe knows how it began, or perhaps even he does not know.
That conclusion represents a massive philosophical leap. We see the trajectory of the texts transitioning from strict ritual action, where the exact pronunciation of a chant is believed to physically compel the storm gods to bring rain, to deep, searching philosophical doubt about the very nature of existence.
I have to ask about the tension there. Does the intense skepticism and philosophical doubt found in the Nasadiya Sukta contradict the absolute certainty demanded by the rigid rituals of the Brahmanas?
It's a fascinating contrast.
You have one part of the tradition demanding mathematical perfection and a fire ritual to control the cosmos, and another part of the text shrugging and saying, maybe no one, not even the creator, knows how the cosmos started.
It is less of a direct contradiction and more of an evolution of inquiry within the society. The rigid rituals of the Brahmanas represent the institutionalization of religion, designed to ensure social cohesion, order, and survival.
It keeps the society running.
Right, but the human mind always pushes against established boundaries. The Nasadiya Sukta, and later the extensive philosophical dialogues of the Upanishads, represent the intellectual elite within that same society questioning the absolute efficacy of the outward physical ritual.
They start looking inward.
They began turning the inquiry inward. They began to view the sacrifice not just as a physical fire burning on an altar, but as a mental and spiritual discipline. The skepticism does not necessarily negate the ritual for them. It transcends it, asking the ultimate metaphysical questions that physical rituals cannot adequately answer.
The interpretation of these texts, both their internal philosophy and their physical, historical origins, has not remained static. Today, they are at the center of intense, highly complex historical and scientific debates.
Very heated debates, yes.
To understand the modern battlefield regarding the origins of the Vedas, we have to look at how modern science has attempted to analyze the ancient texts.
To contextualize the modern debate, we have to look back to the 19th century and the foundations of Western Indology. Scholars like Sir William Jones and Max Muller began applying Western philological methods to the ancient Sanskrit texts.
And what did they find?
As they analyzed the grammar and vocabulary, they recognized deep, undeniable linguistic connections between Sanskrit, ancient Greek, Latin, and other European languages.
And this realization birthed a massive historical framework that still dominates much of the conversation today.
Yes. It laid the foundation for the Aryan migration theory. Based on the linguistic patterns and textual analysis of the Vedas, early Indologists posited that the composers of the texts were part of an Indo-European speaking group that migrated from the Eurasian steppe down into the Indian subcontinent around 1500 BCE.
Okay, bringing their language with them.
According to this theory, they brought the early forms of the Vedic culture, the Sanskrit language, and technologies like the horse-drawn chariot with them.
I want to be perfectly clear to you, the listener. The historical origins of the Vedic texts carry a significant amount of modern political and cultural weight. We are not taking a side in this debate. Our goal is to impartially lay out the evidence and arguments for the different historical theories exactly as they appear in the source material so we can understand the current state of the scientific discussion.
The Aryan migration theory relies heavily on the discipline of comparative linguistics. The shared root words between Sanskrit and European languages, for instance, words for family members like mother and father, or words for certain animals strongly suggest a common ancestral origin outside the Indian subcontinent.
And there is archaeological evidence tied to this as well, right?
Yes, proponents of this theory point to the physical archaeological record. They argue that the material culture explicitly described in the Rigveda, such as the prominence of horses, chariots, and specific types of mobile pastoralism, does not align with the material remains of the earlier indigenous Indus Valley civilization.
The Indus Valley civilization, which peaked around 2500 BCE and was characterized by massive planned brick cities.
Exactly. The lifestyle seemed quite different.
But the sources outline a very strong opposing viewpoint, generally known as indigenous Aryanism or the out-of-India theory.
Indigenous Aryanism challenges the steppe migration model entirely. Proponents of this view argue for a profound cultural and demographic continuity within the Indian subcontinent.
Meaning they don't think there was a major influx of new people.
Right. They suggest that the Vedic civilization and the earlier Indus Valley civilization are essentially the same culture, or at least a continuous cultural evolution. A key piece of evidence they frequently cite is the geography explicitly mentioned in the Rigveda, specifically the intense reverence for a river called the Saraswati.
The textual evidence describes the Saraswati as a massive, flowing, powerful river. But geological evidence indicates that the river system in the region that most likely corresponds to the ancient Saraswati dried up significantly long before 1500 BCE.
Exactly. Proponents of indigenous Aryanism argue that if the composers of the Rigveda are accurately describing a massive flowing Saraswati river, the texts must have been composed much earlier than 1500 BCE, during a period when the river was active.
So they use geology to date the text much earlier.
Yes. They argue this points to an indigenous population composing the texts long before any proposed migration from the steppe. They also strongly critique the early Western Indologists for imposing Eurocentric biases onto the interpretation of the texts, arguing that the entire migration theory was heavily influenced by 19th century colonial paradigms.
In recent years, a completely different scientific discipline has entered this historical debate, attempting to provide hard biological data: genetics.
The advent of ancient DNA sequencing has fundamentally altered the landscape of the debate. Recent large-scale genomic studies focusing on the peopling of India have attempted to track population movements by extracting DNA from ancient human remains.
What do those studies show?
Some notable studies analyzing DNA from ancient individuals in both the Eurasian steppe and the Indian subcontinent have found specific genetic signatures that support a migration of steppe pastoralists into India during the first half of the second millennium BCE.
Which would line up with the linguistic theories.
Yes, proponents of the migration theory argue that this biological data perfectly aligns with the philological timeline established by linguists for the composition of the Vedas.
But extracting DNA from ancient skeletons in the Indian subcontinent is incredibly difficult, isn't it? The intense heat degrades genetic material very rapidly. The sources mention the recent sequencing of Harappan genomes as a major flashpoint in the genetic debate.
The heat makes DNA preservation exceedingly rare. However, geneticists recently managed to extract viable DNA from the petrous bone, a very dense bone in the skull of individuals buried at Rakhigarhi, a major site of the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappans.
And what did that specific DNA reveal?
The analysis of these Harappan genomes showed absolutely no steppe ancestry.
So how do the two sides interpret that specific genetic finding?
Proponents of indigenous Aryanism argue that the lack of steppe DNA in the Harappan remains confirms the indigenous nature of the culture, suggesting the Vedic culture grew out of this indigenous population without any outside migration.
Okay, that is one way to look at it. How about the other side?
Conversely, proponents of the migration theory argue that the Rakhigarhi DNA simply proves that the Harappans predated the arrival of the steppe migrants. They argue the steppe genetic signature only appears in the subcontinent's population after the decline of the Harappan cities, corresponding precisely with the arrival of the Vedic composers.
The difficulty here is reconciling different types of evidence. How do historians combine purely linguistic evidence, tracing the roots of Proto-Indo-European words, with emerging biological evidence from ancient DNA, especially when the fields sometimes seem to tell different stories?
It is incredibly difficult to synchronize.
Words can travel without genes, right? A small group of traders can introduce a new vocabulary without fundamentally altering the gene pool, and genes can travel without words.
It is the ultimate interdisciplinary challenge. A rigorous historian cannot rely on just one data set. Language transfer does not strictly require mass genetic replacement. A small, highly influential group can shift a region's language, or extensive trade and cultural exchange can alter a lexicon.
It's a complex web to untangle.
Modern scholarship attempts to synthesize linguistics, archaeology, and genomics, but there are still significant friction points. It requires very careful critical methods. It is also worth noting that traditional Indian schools of thought, like Mimamsa, remain entirely detached from these historical and genetic debates.
Because they view the texts as eternal.
Exactly. Because they maintain that the texts are eternal and uncreated, the search for the genetic origins or geographical migration of the composers is viewed as entirely irrelevant to the spiritual truth of the verses.
Regardless of where the composers ultimately originated, or how the science eventually settles the timeline of ancient migrations, the sheer impact of the texts on human history is undeniable. We've covered a massive journey today.
We certainly have.
We started with the profound conceptualization of foodie, eternal, authorless sounds, cognized by meditating sages acting as conduits for cosmic truth. We looked at the intricate architecture of the four Vedas and their evolution from strict, external ritual action into deep, internal philosophical inquiry.
We explored the unprecedented mathematical precision of the oral transmission system, the layered complexities of the pathas and the ganapatha that protected these specific verses for millennia against the erosion of time.
An incredible system.
And we examined how the core concepts embedded in the Vedas, like the overarching cosmic order of Rigveda and the societal framework of the Varnas, laid the foundation for an entire civilization's worldview.
Leading right up to the highly contested modern debates over genetics, ancient DNA, and linguistics. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The Vedas were explicitly designed as an oral tradition. For the ancient composers and the generations of students who memorized them, the exact pitch, the rhythm, and the physical vibration of the spoken word in the air was the meaning.
The sound itself was the power.
In the modern era, you and I rely almost entirely on reading translated written texts silently on a page or a screen. If the true essence of the Veda is entirely contained in its specific sound, what fundamental reality is lost when we interact with it in silence? When we read a modern English translation of the Rigveda, are we merely reading the sheet music without ever actually hearing the symphony? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.